capitalize on it.
Now I've got three ways I can go, but let me just hold us for a minute on the Palestinian-Israeli thing. We've got a big, probably crisis coming up here in coming months. There's a real head of steam to seek formal legal recognition of Palestine as a state at the UN. The United States has signaled that we would probably veto that if it came to the Security Council, so now the agenda shifted over to make it a resolution of the General Assembly. And while it may not have legally binding status, it's going to create political momentum, and that's not going to be received well here. What would you do if you were right up now in the NSC? What would you be doing right now for our government to help think through this complex problem?
Well, first of all, I do agree that a resolution of membership for Palestine is essentially a statement rather than the execution, legitimation of a reality. And it can be therefore counterproductive because it doesn't achieve anything except sets in motion expectations, which then may erupt into violence. So there is some legitimacy to the US concern that simply passing a verbose resolution, thereby somehow or other legitimating membership for Palestine in the UN when Palestine doesn't exist as a state, is not the wise course of action. But I don't think analysis of that issue should stop right there, because one has to ask oneself, all right, so suppose we block it, suppose something is passed in the General Assembly contrary to us, where are we then? Well, we're seen thereafter for decades to come as the country which opposes Palestinian independence and Palestinian statehood. That becomes a kind of fundamental marker, which for many people in the region, as we now see reflected in changing Egyptian attitudes, is an important issue. This will stand in sharp contrast to how we voted in 47, 48 when we endorsed the creation of the State of Israel as a Jewish state. And that was the right thing to do at the time, especially in the wake of World War II. But this will stand in sharp contrast to it and will mark us in the region essentially as a power that's hostile to their aspirations. So we have to find a way, in my judgment, of avoiding this thrust to a resolution that in effect recognizes statehood and proclaims it without it existing, and offers something in its place which has the capacity for mobilizing world opinion and to have at least some positive impact, although I don't overestimate its immediate political consequence. And in my judgment, that could be accomplished if we and our principal allies, the Quartet, but also all the members, the permanent members of the Security Council, and probably, in effect, every member of the Security Council, put in a resolution which, in effect, states that the international community insists and demands that the Israelis and the Palestinians undertake serious negotiations for a peace process, the outlines of which are defined by the resolution, thereby, in effect, setting in motion clarity regarding what the eventual outcome will be. Because right now, our position is we want them to negotiate on an equitable basis swaps involving the 67 line. That's our position. The president stated it. And everything else is left unclear. Well, how can they negotiate an agreement on the 67 lines, which would involve some swaps, when they don't know what the other issues will involve and how they might be accommodated, and when they don't even have the opportunity to say, well, we'll be a little more accommodating on the territorial issue if we get this or that. In brief, I think we need a statement from the world, from the international community, as to what the fundamental framework of a peace treaty to be negotiated by the parties in detail ought to be. And that, in my judgment, I've been writing about this now for several years, and it has now become something that it's more or less the position of more and more people internationally, including in the United States, some very prominent political figures from both parties take a similar position, to the effect that it should involve 4 trade-offs that are interrelated and have to be seen as a package. 1, no right of return for the Palestinian refugees to what is today Israel. Because one of the cardinal demands of the Palestinian movement is that the expellees or their descendants have the right to return to their original homes. Well, we cannot expect Israel to commit suicide for the sake of peace. And that's not a reasonable demand. But we can say that while there is no right of return for the expellees, except maybe for a small symbolic number of elderly, very elderly people, not their children and grandchildren, and preferably with the women in no longer childbearing age, so let's say over 80, something like that, but nothing more than that. And for the rest, if the children of the expellees from Lebanon and elsewhere want to be part of the Palestinian state, they will be resettled with international help in the Palestinian state. So that's point number 1, a very bitter pill for the Palestinians to swallow. Then point number 2 is a bitter pill for the Israelis to swallow. But similarly, there can be no peace without addressing that issue. And that is that in some fashion, Jerusalem has to be a capital of 2 states. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is there are 2 different communities living in Jerusalem. And the Palestinians have lived in Jerusalem for centuries. So you cannot ignore that. You cannot simply say people who lived there 2,000 years ago have a right, but anyone thereafter doesn't. These people have been there for centuries. There is an East Jerusalem that actually the Palestinians call Al-Quds. That can be and should be the capital of the Palestinian state. And there are ways of keeping the city open and united. The Palestinians and the Israelis in the Geneva Accords addressed this issue in enormous detail. These are the 2 leading groups from both sides that negotiated, not the governments, not the authorities. And they found a variety of arrangements that are compatible with the city remaining united, but the capital of 2 states. The religious parts have to be shared under some sort of international and maybe jointly religious authority, with one state more responsible for some sectors, the Jewish state responsible clearly for the Jewish sectors, and so forth. And I think that has the possibility of being successful. And not addressing this issue is a prescription for permanent hostility. You can see the dome of the mosque almost anywhere from the West Bank. And it will be just a symbol of the fact that there is no peace of reconciliation. It's a peace of conquest. And therefore, that has to be addressed, difficult as it is for the Israelis, but many of them already recognize that. Barak has talked about that privately. Olmert did, and so forth. It is the religious extremists that are rejecting it. The right wing, which is also not necessarily religious, but more fascist, like the foreign minister, who talks freely about the population of the West Bank being expelled as a solution to the problem. That's the second big part. The third part has been already articulated. Borders, swaps, based roughly in the 67 lines, without any substantial change in the territorial distribution of the old Palestine. What many people forget is that today, if one uses the 67 lines, the territory of the old Palestine is 78% Israeli, 22% Palestinian, even though the size of the populations are almost similar. The Israelis are somewhat more numerous still than the Palestinians, but this will not endure because the demographic dynamics favor the Palestinians. So you cannot change those proportions. You cannot have a situation in which all of a sudden the territorial split becomes 85% Israeli, 15% Palestinian. It's already 78% versus 22. This is why the swaps have to be equal. That's the reasoning behind it. And of course, the last element is security arrangements so that the Israelis do not feel vulnerable. And I think the placing of American troops or NATO troops on the Jordan River banks is, I think, probably one key element in it. The other being that basically Palestine will not be a militarized state. It will be demilitarized. Now, putting something like this in front of the UN would elicit, in my judgment, almost certainly the unanimous vote of the Security Council. Secondly, I think there's a reasonable chance that a big majority of the international community would vote for it. And that would avoid a situation in which otherwise I think we essentially take a vote in which we become stamped as the enemy by one of the two parties, namely the Palestinians and the Arabs. Then the world community endorses something different. Palestinian frustrations rise, and then just think where this will take Egypt, for example, as it tries to define itself in a more independent fashion. And we already see previews of where it's going to go. Talk about a relationship with Iran between Egypt, talk about opening up to Gaza, talk about revising the treaty, the agreements regarding energy deliveries, and so forth. In whose interest is that? But the question is whether we have the determination, the leadership to do it. I'll bet you anything that every European country would support it. The Chinese would support it. I think the Russians would support it. And I think the majority of the international community would support it.
We could stay in this region, but I want to spin the globe